They marched her people east in the winter of '86, chained at the wrists, and when her ankle turned bad on the third day out of Bowie, they left her sitting in the road like a dropped glove. Nobody came back for her, not her cousin, not the soldiers who counted heads and found the number close enough, not God if you believe in that sort of thing out here. She walked 40 miles on a ruined foot and came down out of the Chiricahuas into a valley that had no use for her at all, into the yard of a man who was, that very morning, digging a grave for his own brother. I'm the one who dug it. I want you to understand that before we go any further. I had the shovel in my hands and my brother wasn't dead yet, and I couldn't tell you which of those two facts shamed me more. What happened after that took 11 weeks, cost me everything I owned, and taught me that the people we leave behind are the only ones who know how to stay. This is her story. I only kept the ledger. The ground out past the corral is caliche about 8 inches down, hard as a church pew, and I'd been at it since before light. 2 feet. That's what I had to show for 3 hours. My palms had opened up in the old places and closed and opened again, and there was blood on the shovel handle that I kept wiping on my trousers like it belonged to somebody else. Emmett wasn't dead. I want that clear. My brother was lying inside the house on a rope bed with his good eye shut and his bad one half open the way it stayed now, and he was breathing, and I was outside digging him a hole. I told myself it was practical. Ground freezes in January. Better to have it ready. I told myself that for 4 days, and the lie had gone soft and gray like meat left out. Truth is, I wanted him to hear it. The shovel, chunk, chunk. I wanted him to lie there in the dark listening to his little brother dig, and I wanted it to make him angry enough to get up. That's the kind of man I was in the winter of 1886. I'd like to say I've improved. The windmill was creaking. It creaks on the downstroke, always has, a sound like somebody being asked a question they don't want to answer. I stop to spit and to count, because I count things when my hands shake fence posts, cattle, the ribs on a starving cow, doesn't matter. I just count and it steadies me. And I'd gotten to 11 posts along the north line when I saw her standing at the stock tank. She was drinking out of her hand. Not scooping, cupping. Slow, like a woman who had learned that water can be taken away from you if you look too eager about it. I have thought about that for 30 years, the slowness of it. I went for the rifle the way you'd go for your hat, without deciding to, and I had it up and on her before I'd worked out that she wasn't armed and wasn't running and wasn't, near as I could tell, entirely alive. She turned her head. That was all. Just turned her head and looked at me down the barrel with an expression I have never once been able to name. Not fear. Not defiance either, which is what the newspapers would have wanted, and not that hollowed-out nothing you see on men who have given up. Something in the neighborhood of patience, like I was weather. She was maybe 30, maybe 22, hunger lies about age. Deerskin skirt gone black at the hem with old blood and new mud, a wool blanket over her shoulders that had US stamped on the corner of it, hair chopped short and ragged at the jaw. Chiricahua. You didn't need a scout to tell you that in that valley in that year. Her left foot was wrong. That's the polite way to put it. The ankle had swollen up over the top of the moccasin until the seams had split, and the flesh coming through was the color of a thundercloud, and she was standing on it. Not favoring it. Standing on it, weight square, because she'd worked out somewhere in the last 100 miles that if you limp, they know. Get on, I said. My voice came out cracked from not using it. Go on, get. She looked at the rifle. She looked at me. Then she bent down, slow as syrup, and cupped up another handful of water and drank it while I stood there pointing a Winchester at her head. I want to tell you, I lowered the rifle out of decency. What actually happened is that my brother started screaming inside the house, the way he did most mornings around then, that thin sound that didn't have any words in it, and my hands went to shaking so bad I couldn't have hit the barn. And when I looked back at the tank, she was watching the house. Head tilted, listening. and I saw something cross her face that I recognized because I'd seen it in the shaving mirror. She wasn't afraid of the screaming. She was counting it. Here's what I knew about Emmett Ormsby in December of that year. He was 47. He was my brother by the same mother and a different amount of luck. He had ridden as a civilian scout out of Fort Bowie for 11 years, which meant he spoke enough Apache to bargain and enough Spanish to insult, and he had come home in September with his left hand crushed into a claw and his left eye gone milky, on account of a horse going over backward on him in a wash near Skeleton Canyon. That's what he told people, the horse. He'd been eating less every week since. By December, he was taking maybe 4 spoonfuls of anything I put in front of him, and he'd started turning his face to the wall when I came in. And one night I'd found him out at the woodpile at 2 in the morning holding the axe in his good hand, not doing anything with it, just holding it, and looking at the sky like he was waiting on someone to give him permission. I'd taken the axe away. Neither of us mentioned it then or ever. I run about 200 head in a good year. That year I had 106, and 30 of them wouldn't see spring. I had a hired man named Cortez who quit in October when I couldn't pay him, and a mortgage held by a bank in Tombstone that was owned by a man who'd never seen a cow, and a brother who wanted to die. I kept it all in a ledger, everything. Head count, rainfall, the price of nails. In the back pages where the columns ran out, I'd started writing other things. Nav 3, E spoke twice. Nav 11, E spoke none. Nav 19, E asked if the roan was still lame. Good day. A man keeps a ledger of what he's afraid of losing. She didn't come to the house that first day. She slept, I think, in the brush corral where I'd wintered the sick calves, and I know she took a strip of jerky off the drying line, because I'd counted them the day before 18, and there were 17, and I stood there like a fool doing arithmetic on a piece of dried beef. Second day she was at the tank again at first light. Third day she was closer. Fourth day I came out of the barn and found her sitting on the chopping block, with my brother's crushed hand in both of hers. I don't know how she got him out there. I'd left him in bed. He was sitting on an upturned bucket in his union suit with his hair every direction, and she had that ruined claw of his laid across her knees, and she was doing something to it with her thumbs, pressing along the bones and out into the fingers, and Emmett had his eye closed and his head back and his mouth open, and I thought, God help me, she's killed him. And then I saw his throat move and understood that he was crying. I had the rifle. I always had the rifle. She looked up at me over his shoulder, and she said in English, plain as a preacher, "He is not dying, he is quitting. It is not the same." Then she went back to his hand. She had 6 words of English that first week, and then she had 200, and I came to understand she'd been at San Carlos, where they teach you English the way they teach a dog the whip. She never said much about that. She said the word school once and then didn't say it again. Her name was Nailin. I said it wrong for 4 days. She corrected me the first 3 times and then quit correcting me, which was worse. And when I finally got it right, the vowel further back in the throat than a white mouth wants to go, she didn't smile or nod. She just said, yes, and kept scraping the hide she was scraping. That's how she gave out approval, like it cost her. I'll tell it straight, I did not want her there. I was afraid of what the neighbors would say, which is a coward's fear, and I knew it even then. I was afraid of Colonel Wade at Bowie, who was collecting the last of them like a boy collecting bird eggs. And I was afraid, in a place I couldn't look at directly, of how my brother's face changed when she came through the door. Because he ate for her. 10 days he hadn't taken more than broth from me, his own blood, who'd carried him out of the Verd in 78, and she set a bowl of the same beans I'd been making, the same beans, on his knee, and stood there with her arms folded and said something low in Apache, and he picked up the spoon and ate the whole thing while she watched. I asked her what she'd said to him. She said, I told him the beans are bad and he must eat them anyway. It is a thing my grandmother said. It is not important. I put it in the ledger that night. Deck 14 E8, full bowl, woman here. I couldn't make myself write her name for another 2 weeks. The ankle was rotting. I don't know a gentler word. By the middle of the month it had gone the color of an eggplant up past the bone knob, and there was a smell coming off it that I knew from cattle, and she was still walking on it, still hauling water, still climbing up on the bucket to reach the high shelf. And one afternoon I lost my temper and grabbed her by the shoulder and told her she was going to lose the foot and probably the leg and probably her life. And did she understand that? Did she understand English that well? And she took my wrist and moved my hand off her shoulder with a strength I was not expecting, and she said, "If I sit down, I will not stand up again. That is what happened on the road." She said it flat, no self-pity in it anywhere. Then she went and got the water. I sat down on the chopping block and put my head in my hands for a while. That night I heated a knife in the stove until it went straw-colored, and I told her I'd done it on horses and once on a man, and she said she had done it on herself, on the second day, with a stone, and had not cut deep enough because she had been afraid. She lay down on the table. She put a strip of latigo leather between her teeth. She did not take my hand, and she did not close her eyes. And when I put the knife in, she made a sound like a door in the wind, and then no sound at all. And I got out more than I want to describe in a story anybody's children might hear. Emmett held the lamp, his good hand steady as stone, for the first time since September. That's the thing nobody tells you about wanting to die. Sometimes it just needs somebody else's emergency to be more interesting than your own. Afterward she lay on the table breathing, and there was sweat standing on her upper lip, and she turned her head and looked at Emmett holding the lamp, and she said something to him in Apache, 3 or 4 words, quiet, and my brother went white. Whiter than she was, whiter than the knife. He set the lamp down very carefully, like it was full of something, and he walked out the door into the January dark without a coat. He didn't come back for 6 hours. I found him at the grave. My grave. The one I dug for him and never filled in, 2 feet deep and full of frost, and he was sitting on the edge of it with his boots hanging down into the hole and his breath going up white. "You dug this for me," he said. "I did." "Was you going to say some words?" "Hadn't got that far." He laughed. It sounded terrible. He hadn't laughed since Skeleton Canyon, and I'd forgotten what a bad, cracked, wonderful noise it was. We sat there a while. The stars out here in winter are a scandal. There's too many of them, and neither of us was looking at anything else. "She was on the road," he said finally, "in September, when we moved them out of Bowie to the cars. I figured." "Wade," he turned his head. In the dark I could only see the good eye. "I was on the road." The windmill creaked, downstroke, that question again. "I know what you did for a living," I said. "You don't know a goddamn thing." His voice didn't rise. That was what frightened me. There was a count. There's always a count, morning and night, and the count come up one short the second night out of Bowie, and a lieutenant named Price asked me, Wade, because I was the one who spoke it, whether it was worth turning the column around for one lame woman. He stopped. He worked the ruined hand open and shut with the other one, the way she'd shown him. And I said no. I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything. I said, "She'll be dead by Thursday, sir, and it's 40 miles back." His breath went up white, and he wrote deceased in the book, and we went on. And 2 days later that horse went over on me in the wash, and I have thought every hour since that it was. He couldn't finish it. He put his face in his good hand. "That's why you quit eating," I said, stupid, slow, my brother sitting on the lip of his own grave. "I thought God had run out of ways to speak to me," Emmett said. And then she walked up out of the Chiricahuas and drank out of my stock tank. Here is what I have never been able to explain to anybody, not to the priest at Wilcox, not to my wife when I finally got one, not to my own children. She knew. She knew before that night. She had known from the first week, because Emmett had a scout's brass button on the coat hanging by our door, and she had seen him on that road, seen his face, heard his voice giving an answer in a language she understood. She sat with his hand in her lap and pressed the bones straight and told him the beans were bad and he must eat them anyway. She had every right to burn the house down around us. I asked her about it once much later in March when the Ocotillo came out red on the ridge and she was mending a stirrup leather with her leg propped on the rail, what was left of that foot wrapped in flannel. I said, "Why?" I said, "You knew what he was. Why in God's name did you feed him?" And Nayland thought about it long enough that I figured she wouldn't answer. Then she said, "My son was 6. She kept sewing. They all went through the leather and out. On the road, the soldiers put us in the wagons in the morning and the children rode with the old women. When my foot went bad, I could not keep the pace. My cousin's husband said, 'Sit down, we will send someone.' They all went through again. They did not send someone. That is all right. They could not. If they had turned around, the soldiers would have shot 4 men, and then the 4 men's children would have had no fathers." "Nayland, you want me to say I hate him?" She looked up at me then, and her eyes were dry and terrible and full of a knowledge I did not have and did not want. "I have hated. It is not so hard as this. Anyone can hate. My son is on a train to a fort in Florida where he will be told his mother is dead, and there is nothing in me that can reach him, nothing, and every night I lie here in a white man's barn and I do not die." She pulled the stitch tight. "So I must be for something. There is a man in that house who wants to walk out into the dark and stop. I am not going to let him." She bit the thread. "That is not forgiveness," she said. "Do not make it a pretty thing. I will not have you making it pretty. But I'm ahead of myself, and I promise to tell it in order. Because in January, the day after Emmett sat on the edge of his own grave, 3 things happened, and they came in this order. Emmett got up before I did and had the fire going. Nayland's fever broke, and a boy on a mule came out from Wilcox with a folded paper from the army, addressed to Mr. E. Ormsby, civilian scout, requesting his attendance at Fort Bowie in the matter of certain irregularities in the count of persons removed from the San Carlos agency in September of 1886, one such person having been reported deceased and subsequently reported living. Somebody had talked. In that country, somebody always did. I read it twice on the porch with the mule blowing steam and the boy waiting for a coin I didn't have. Then I went inside, where my brother was sitting at the table teaching an Apache woman the English word for hinge, of all the words in the language, and she was laughing at how stupid it sounded, and it was the first time I ever heard her laugh, and I stood in my own doorway with that paper in my hand, and I could not make my mouth work. Emmett saw my face. He looked at the paper, and then he looked at her, and his good eye did something I hadn't seen in it since we were boys, and he took a beating for a fence I broke. He said quietly, "Wade, go hitch the wagon." And Nayland, who had gone very still, who understood more English by then than either of us had accounted for, said one word. She said no. And the fire popped, and the windmill asked its question, and out past the corral the 2-foot hole I dug for my brother sat there in the cold ground with nobody in it, waiting to see what we'd do. There were 2 Wades in this story, and I have hated that coincidence for 30 years. Wade Ormsby is what my mother wrote in the family Bible in Kentucky in 1849. Colonel Wade at Fort Bowie was a Pennsylvania man with a clean collar who had never in his life stood a whole day in the sun without a hat, and every time somebody in this valley said the name, half the time it meant him, and half the time it meant me, and there was no way on God's earth to tell which until the sentence was over. I say this because when my brother stood up from the table that morning and said, "Wade, go hitch the wagon," I felt the floor tilt under me. And for a half-second, I did not know which of us he was talking to. That's what the army does to a country. It gets into the names. Nayland said no. She said it once and did not repeat it, which was her way. She stood up from the bench with her weight going carefully onto the wrapped foot, and she looked at the folded paper in my hand. She couldn't read it, but she knew what a folded paper meant. She'd had a whole life explained to her by folded papers. And she said, "No." And then she went out the door and across the yard to the brush corral where she slept, and she did not come back in for 11 hours. Emmett didn't go after her. He sat there working his ruined hand open and shut. "She knows what it means," he said. "Then explain it to me, because I've read this 3 times and all I see is your name and a date." "It means the book was wrong." He looked up. "Wade, there's a book. There's always a book. Morning count and night count, and every name in it is either present or deceased or escaped, and there is no fourth column. That's the whole machine. That's all it is. A man in a tent writes a word beside your name, and that word is what you are. And she's deceased." He said it like something he'd swallowed and couldn't bring back up. "I made her that. I opened my mouth on the road on the second night out of Bowie, and I made a living woman into a word." The fire popped. I counted the pops, 4 before he spoke again. "If she's living," Emmett said, "she goes east, to the men, to Florida or Alabama, wherever they've put them this month. And if she's dead," he shrugged, and it was the ugliest gesture I ever saw a man make, "then she can stay in your barn and mend leather and be nobody until she's actually dead, and no soldier will ever come." I stood there in my own house, with the paper going soft in my fist. "Then let her be dead," I said. Emmett looked at me a long time. "Her son thinks she's dead," he said. "That's the part you haven't done the arithmetic on. I have a habit, I count. Fence posts, cattle, the pops of a fire, the beats between the windmills creak. It started when I was 9 and my father was dying loud in the next room, and I lay in the dark and counted the knots in the ceiling boards, 41 of them, and I have never once in my life been able to stop. That night I went out and counted the herd by moonlight, 104. I'd lost 2 more in the arroyo since Christmas. Then I counted the money in the coffee tin, which took no time, and the years on the mortgage, which took less. And then I sat on the chopping block in the cold and tried to count something that would not come out to a number. 1 woman 40 miles. 1 boy 6 years old on a train. 1 word in a book. Nayland came out of the brush corral at some point and stood a way off. She had that army blanket around her shoulders with the U.S. stamped on it, which I had offered a dozen times to burn, and she had a dozen times refused. And I understood later that she kept it for exactly the same reason I kept a ledger. "Your brother is not sleeping," she said. "No." "Good." She said it without cruelty. That was the thing about her, she could say a hard thing with no cruelty in it at all, and it landed twice as heavy for that. A man who has done a thing should not sleep for a while. Then he should sleep and get up and do work. Not sleeping forever is only another way of lying down. She lowered herself onto the wood pile, slow, keeping the foot up. "He told you," she said. "About the count. About my son." I didn't answer. Out past the corral, the 2-foot hole I dug for my brother sat there full of frost, and the moon had gotten down into it somehow, and it looked like a hole with a little water at the bottom, and there wasn't any water within 8 inches of the top. "His name is Chi," Nayland said. "It means red. It was a joke about his hair when he was born. It was not red, it was black like everyone's. My husband thought he was very funny." She pulled the blanket closer. "My husband was killed at Guadalupe Canyon in the spring. Chi has been on a train since September and he is 7 now. His birthday is in the cold moon. It has passed. Nobody said anything to him about it." The windmill creaked, downstroke, that question. "They told him you were dead." "They read the book to us," she said. "Every morning they read the book. He heard my name and the word beside it." She was quiet a while. "He is 7, she said again, like she was checking the arithmetic herself and it kept coming out wrong. Jan 9, 104 head. E did not eat, N did not eat, nobody ate. Jan 10 rode to Wilcox. Bank says nothing to say. Jan 11, E asked for his boots. He went to Bowie on the 12th. He didn't ask me to come and I came anyway, and he didn't argue about it, which is how brothers say thank you in my family. Fort Bowie sat up in the pass with the whole Chiricahua Range standing behind it like a jury. Adobe and dust, and a flagpole, and a line of new pine buildings going up on the north side, because somebody in Washington had decided the Apache wars were over, and it was safe now to build in wood. They put us in an anteroom for 2 hours. I counted the nailheads in the floor, 216 that I could see, and a good many more under the desk. Lieutenant Price was younger than I'd built him in my head. That was the first cruelty. I'd made him 50 and gray and comfortable, and he was maybe 28, with a cowlick he kept pressing down, and he stood up when we came in and shook my brother's hand and was glad to see him, and I understood in that moment that the machine does not require monsters. It only requires men who have somewhere else to be. Ormsby, he had a face like a boy at a funeral. God, your eye. It's fine. They said he stopped, recalibrated, gestured at the chairs. Well, there was a book on the desk, not a big one. Ledger, canvas boards, the corner gnawed by mice. I looked at it and my hands started shaking and I put them under the table like a schoolboy. There's a complaint, Price said. Anonymous. Somebody wrote to the department that a woman recorded deceased on the removal is living in Sulphur Springs Valley. Somebody wrote, Emmett said. Somebody always writes. Price pressed the cowlick down. It'll be Halloran or that fool at the store, doesn't matter. Point is it's in Washington now and Washington has asked and the colonel has to answer. He turned the ledger around, opened it, ran his finger down. I saw it upside down. A column of names in a clerk's copperplate, each one with a word beside it, and the words all the same, over and over, present, 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 and then one that wasn't. Price put his finger on it. Now, he said, and he was trying to be kind, that's what I've never gotten past, he was trying. Here's the thing, Ormsby. The book says deceased. You said deceased. I wrote deceased. If the book is right, we've all had a hard morning and we go home. He looked up. Is the book right? And there it was. The whole thing, laid out on a desk in a room that smelled like ink and boot polish. One word. Emmett didn't look at me. He put his good hand flat on the table beside the ledger. No, sir, he said, the book is wrong. I have gone back over that moment more times than I can tell you, and I have never once been sure he did the right thing. Understand what he bought and what he spent. He spent himself. A civilian scout who gives a false count has committed a fraud upon the United States, and though they never tried him, they never tried anybody. That was the year the Army was busy being congratulated. He never scouted again, never drew another dollar of federal pay, and there is a letter in a file somewhere in Washington with his name in it and the word unreliable, and Emmett Ormsby went to his grave knowing it was there. And he bought her a train ticket to a prison. Because the second Price's pen touched that page and turned deceased into living, Nayland was property of the count again. Article, paragraph, subsection. She would be gathered up and put on the cars and shipped east to Mount Vernon Barracks in Alabama, which was a swamp with a fence around it, where they had put 498 Chiricahua, and where they were dying of consumption at a rate the newspapers did not print. Where her son was. Price sat with the pen in his hand for a long moment. You know what this does, he said quietly. I know exactly what it does. She's safe, Ormsby. Nobody's looking. She could live out her. She's not safe. Emmett's voice never rose, not once that whole day. She's erased. There's a difference and I've had 4 months to learn it. Price looked at me. For help, I think. God knows why. I was a man with 104 cows and dirt under his nails and no standing anywhere in the world. There's a boy, I said, it came out hoarse, in Alabama. 7 years old. Somebody read him her name out of a book like that one and told him it meant she was gone. Price set the pen down. He got up and went to the window and stood there with his back to us, and outside somebody was calling cadence, and the pass wind was doing what the pass wind does. "I have a son," he said to the glass. Then he came back and he sat down, and he wrote a word. We did not tell her. That is the single act of my life I would take back, if the Lord ever offered, and I have made my peace with a great deal else. We rode home in the dark, and I sat up in the kitchen composing sentences and throwing them away, and Emmett went out to the brush corral at dawn and told her flat and plain in her own language, standing in front of her with his hat in his good hand, and I watched from the porch and could not hear a word of it and did not need to. She hit him. Once open-handed, hard enough to turn his head, and he took it and stood back up straight. And then she put both hands over her mouth and stood there in the gray light with her shoulders going, and my brother didn't touch her and didn't say anything, just stood there and let her. And after a while she took her hands down and said something short, and he nodded. Later I asked what she'd said. He said she asked if the paper had the boy's name on it. Did it? No, Emmett said, it had hers. He rubbed his face. That's what the slap was for. I gave her back a name and she wanted his. She had 11 days before the escort came. I have never in my life seen a person work like that. She mended every stirrup leather and every bridle on the place. She rebuilt the brush corral's north wall, one-handed on a crutch I made her out of a mesquite fork, because the wind came in there and the calves suffered. She dug out the arroyo crossing where I'd lost the 2 head at Christmas, dug it with a shovel, on 1.5 feet, and would not let me help, and when I tried she looked at me until I stopped. I understood it eventually. She was paying. Not for the food, for the 11 weeks, for lying down in a white man's barn and not dying, for being for something. She had 11 days to be a person who did work and left a place better than she found it, and after that she would be a number in Alabama, and she meant to spend every hour of it. On the 4th night the norther came through, and we lost 14 head in the brush along the arroyo, bunched and smothered. And I stood in that gray daylight afterward and counted them twice, and got 14 both times and sat down in the snow. 90 head. The mortgage said 120 by June. Nayland came and stood over me. She didn't say anything sympathetic. She said, "The dead ones, skin them. The hides are worth something, and it is going to be a long spring." That's what I mean about her. That's exactly what I mean. Feb 1, 90 head. Sold the roan, sold the second wagon, sold the good saddle. Feb 2, sold the ledger's father, I suppose. Sold everything but this. Feb 3, rode to Wilcox. Says there is a way. Here is what my brother did with the last money either of us had in the world, and I did not learn it for 3 years. He did not hire a lawyer. There was no lawyer to hire. You cannot sue the United States over a word in a book. He bought a clerk. There was a man at the Southern Pacific Depot in Bowie Station, a freight clerk named Dolan with a wife in Tucson and a bad debt, and there was a corporal in the quartermasters who handled the manifests for prisoner transport, and between them, for $190 and my brother's saddle and his father's watch, they changed the destination on a single line of a shipping order. The escort had orders to deliver 1 Chiricahua female, adult, to the depot at Bowie Station for onward transport to Mount Vernon Barracks, Alabama. Mount Vernon Barracks was where the adults went. The children, the ones they'd taken off the trains in September, the ones with their hair cut and their names replaced. The children had gone to Carlisle, in Pennsylvania, and a good many of them had died there, and the ones who died had their bodies shipped nowhere and their names entered in a book. And Emmett Ormsby, who had spent 11 years learning exactly how the machine wrote its words, had gotten hold of the Carlisle roll for September and October and November of 1886. Chee's name was not on the death roll. His name was on a transfer list. 12 boys moved in December from Carlisle to Mount Vernon Barracks on account of, and here I am quoting the paper my brother carried in his coat until it fell apart, unsuitability of climate. Which is how the army wrote they were coughing blood, and we sent them to their mothers to do it. He had it. He had it in his coat for 11 days and he did not tell her, because he had learned by then what a thing is worth that has not been checked twice. And if he'd been wrong, if there was a second chi, if the clerk had erred, if the boy had died between the writing and the reading. He was afraid. My brother, who had gone into the Verd after Chiricahua raiders with 11 men and come out with 9. He was afraid to give a woman good news. The escort came on a Tuesday. 2 troopers and a corporal, and none of them older than 22, and one of them called her ma'am, and I had to walk away and stand behind the barn for a minute. She had nothing to pack. She had the blanket with US on it, and the mesquite crutch, and a strip of latigo leather she'd been carrying since the night on the table, and a little sodal fiber thing she'd braided that I never asked about. She came to me last. Wade Ormsby, she said. She had never once called me Wade alone. She used the whole name every time like a title, like she was reading it off a paper. The north fence. The 4th post from the gate is bad. I could not fix it. You must dig it out entire, not patch it, do you hear me? I hear you. Do not patch it. I won't patch it. She nodded. She looked past me at the house, at the tank, at the windmill going around asking its question. Then she looked at the hole out past the corral, that 2-foot hole, still there, still empty, and I had not touched it since December and could not have told you why. Fill it in, she said. Nailin'. You dug it to make him hear, she said. He heard it, fill it in. And she got up in the wagon. I did not go to the station. That was Emmett. He rode alongside the wagon the 14 miles to Bowie Station, with the corporal permitting it out of some instinct he probably could not have explained. And at the depot he waited while they entered her on the manifest. And Dahlin, the freight clerk, did not look at him. And the line on the shipping order said what it had said since Thursday. And then my brother took a piece of paper out of his coat and gave it to her. He never told me what he said. I asked twice and he wouldn't, and after the second time I stopped asking, and now he's been dead 19 years and I never will know. I know she couldn't read it. I know he had to read it to her, standing on a platform in the wind with soldiers 10 feet away, and I know he got as far as the 12 names and stopped and pointed and put his finger on it, and she took the paper out of his hands. The train came at 4. He said she didn't cry. He said she stood very straight with the paper folded into her fist and the crutch under her arm, and just before they put her up into the car, she turned around and looked at him. And she said in English, so the soldiers could hear it, which is the part that has always undone me, she said it in English. You did not send someone, then you sent someone. And she went east. 3 years and 4 months later, a letter came to the post office at Wilcox addressed to EORMSBY, Ranch, Sulphur Springs Valley, Arizona, and it had been written by somebody else's hand and signed with a mark, and it said 9 words. It said he is 14, he is living, the fence held. Emmett read it on the porch and then he handed it to me and walked out past the corral and stood a long time in the place where the hole used to be, because I had filled it in March on the day she left, with the shovel that still had my blood on the handle. It took me an hour and 40 minutes. I counted. 61 shovelfuls of the dirt I'd taken out and 11 more from the pile, because ground settles, because ground always settles, because there is never quite enough dirt to fill a hole you've dug. He stood there a while. Then he came back and sat down and picked up the letter again and read it maybe 4 times, and he said, "The fence held," and laughed that terrible cracked laugh. 4th post from the gate, I said. You dig it out entire. I did. Not patch it. I didn't patch it, Emmett. And my brother, who had killed a woman with 1 word, and then spent everything he had in the world unsaying it, put his face down into his ruined hand and made a sound I had not heard from him since the winter, and I sat there beside him on the step and counted the beats between the creak of the windmill. 7, always 7, downstroke, question, no answer, and did not touch him because she wouldn't have. There is nothing in my ledger for that day. I looked before I wrote this. The whole page is blank. We never heard from her again. I want to say I don't know why, but I do know why, or I know the 4 or 5 reasons it could be, and every one of them is a thing I can bear on a good day and not on a bad one. She was 51 when the last of the Chiricahua were let go from Alabama, if she lived that long. There is a woman's name that looks like hers on a roll from Fort Sill in 1894, and there is another one that looks like hers on a burial list from Mount Vernon in 1891, and I have written to both places and been answered by clerks, and I have learned exactly nothing except that the machine is still running, and it still keeps its books very neat. I am 71 years old. I have 206 head, a wife who is patient, a son named Emmett who is nothing like his uncle, and a fourth post from the gate that I have replaced entire 4 times in 30 years because I will not patch it. Last spring, a man came up the road on a bay horse. He was a grown man, 40 near enough. He had a bad cough and a good hat, and he sat that horse the way you sit one when it's the only thing you own, and he stopped at the stock tank, and he did not get down, and he looked at the house for a long time. And I came out of the barn with my hands full of wire, and I saw him and I stopped. He bent down, slow as syrup, and he cupped up a handful of water out of the tank and he drank it.